Okay, we are back with Jess Goldberg. Jess, good to see you.
Good to see you again.
So we are diving straight into culture. So I would love if we could start with what are your thoughts on how do you explain to somebody what culture is?
That's great. That's a great question. So, how do I explain what culture is? Culture truly is, it's the heartbeat of an organization. It's what drives people. It's how people feel when they show up at work and also how they do their work together.
So I'm sitting and I'm thinking about the CEOs and founders that I know. And one of the biggest questions that comes up is, when do I need to start caring about culture? And so I hear that and I think, well, like that definition kind of sounds like I should always be caring about it. But should I always be caring about it?
Yes, you should always care about culture. Every leader should care about culture from day one.
Okay, say more about that. Make the case.
Okay, so there's different stages of culture. And so you might need to care about different things in the development of your organization and what you might look at in culture. But in the very early stages, when you have another, maybe it's only one other employee, you still need to care about how do they feel about how they show up in work? How engaged are they? How are they going to actually meaningfully get the work done that you want to have them get done? And so in the early stages of companies, often what we focus on is, innovation, creativity, driving, getting just from 0 to 1 very quickly. And then as culture grows, as the company grows, we have to shift how we think about culture. And we have to go from, okay, maybe everyone knows each other and we can have had relationships based upon everyone just have had conversations with one another. And then we have to start to develop processes. We have to develop and formulate what we're going to actually put it together as. So we have to create what are the values that we actually want everyone to do. We have to put in processes. We have to actually name it and put it down on paper so that when people come in that are new and maybe they don't have a chance to talk to every single person in the organization, they can understand, how am I supposed to show up in this organization? What does this organization care about? Do I care about those too? Do I want to join this team?
Yeah, and I love that word care, because when I really started getting into this work, I didn't understand nearly enough about culture. Like, the way that I got to it was I was working with schools actually, and I was going into schools and I was trying to show them what the behavior science said about, effective teaching as well as classroom management. And I discovered pretty early on that people hated the youngest guy in the building coming in and telling them how they should do their job. And so people weren't really doing the things that I was making really good cases that the science was saying, here's what's effective. And I was really frustrated. So I was like, what is happening here? And so I dove deep into a ton of industrial organizational research and the behavior science around organizational psychology. And I'm also just obsessed with etymology because I'm weird and into philosophy and Latin. And culture is such a beautiful word because it comes from the Latin word for care. That a culture is really the makeup of what you care about as an organization. And it's defined not by what you say, but what you do.
Yes, absolutely. Culture is not built in a PowerPoint slide. It's built by the actions that we do every single day.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you think if you're a team of 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15, you should care about culture just as much as if you're a team of 500, 50, 500, 5,000?
Yes, absolutely. You should care about it just as much, but how much time, energy, and effort you invest into putting in processes is different. How much effort you put into formalizing it is different. In the early stages, culture might just be built by you having a one-on-one coffee with your employee in the morning before you get started. And they feel that connection with you. They feel that care. They understand the things that you care about. But the larger your organization gets, if you are any leader at any scale, you're going to have, not everyone are you going to be able to touch on every single day. So how do you create everyone so that everyone kind of holds up those standards that maybe you in that one-on-one relationship already had? Sure. So culture is easy to build when you know everyone, when everyone gets to feel you and everyone gets to understand and they can bring up things that are concerns. But when it gets larger, you have to create processes and systems in order to support that.
Yeah, so early on when teams are smaller, the way that a culture feels, the way people might describe a culture is really about the relationships of the people
Yes.
they're interacting with every day. And so early on, you might not be thinking about it as culture. You might just be thinking about how you're treating people and how you're relating with the people that you're working with. But ultimately, you're still creating a culture that no matter what, a culture always exists. It's just when you start to scale, you have to get more intentional about the processes you're putting in place, about what sort of culture you're building and reinforcing.
Yes, and there's still relationships. When it's large, it's still about relationships, but it's relationships at scale.
Yeah. And I think that's a really beautiful reminder. When we talk about culture, it can sometimes fall into spiraling into conversations about human resources and regulations and like accountability structures and like paid time off and things like that, or like perks that you give people. But really, what we're talking about is how do you structure and support relationships within the workplace?
Yes, relationships and purpose and meaning.
Say more about that.
So culture isn't just about how do I feel with this other person, but how do I feel about what we're collaborating and building on together?
Sure.
What's that greater, bigger thing that we're building together as a group? And so, one of the people who I actually think ironically speaks really well about this is Yuval Noah Harari. He wrote the book Sapiens, and he talks about how as humans, what we're really good at is building stories. And that's how we, as humans, were able to be the species that were able to conquer the world, is that we were able to create stories that allow us to build relationships with people who we might not even know personally. And that's what a great organization does, is they create a story that everyone can buy into, that everyone believes, that allows them to understand how they should operate within the organization.
Yeah, I love that you just brought up Yuval, because I think that the story and argument that he lays out in Sapiens, as well as the argument he lays out in his latest book, Nexus,
Yes.
are really core to understanding the challenges and opportunities to shaping culture within a modern workplace. And the way I would frame that for folks is similar to like the preamble to this episode, is until a few hundred years ago, you could even argue even like just like about 100 years ago, people's work was really connected to their life and their livelihood. And so there was innate purpose kind of woven within there. People were farmers, artisans, blacksmiths, and they were engaging with people who they lived in close proximity with. It's really only with the automobile in the early 1900s and then the advancements with the telephone and the internet that we had such residential mobility, and people are working with people that they might not ever really meet in person. Mm-hmm. And so this sense of connection as well as a sense of purpose really only started to become a massive challenge once you started to have businesses at scale that weren't necessarily rooted in physical community and so closely tied to people's day-to-day lives. And so this is a really unique challenge of our modern times, and it's really hard to look at how culture management and culture building are broken in the modern world without understanding what Yuval's case is in his latest book, which is that our information networks are broken.
Yes.
That ultimately, you can say what you want about news companies, newspapers, broadcasting, news radio, and you could say what you want about the peer review scientific process, but ultimately what they have within them are self-correcting mechanisms that allow for layers of humans to be held accountable and layers of policies and regulations to be advocated for by different groups of people. What has happened is, as we have innovated the speed and scale of information that we can communicate, is like we've sort of started to lose a sense of shared truth that grounds our shared sanity, while also our attention is sort of getting fragmented as it's being competed over by the biggest companies in the world. And so workers are showing up to work more stressed than ever because we're lacking a sense of shared truth and connectedness as loneliness is skyrocketing. And that means more than ever, it's important to figure out ways to help workers be productive that actually addresses that stress, because otherwise they won't be productive. And culture is crucial for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that point that you're making. We have more knowledge than ever, but less wisdom. And I think when we think about, what's broken in today's culture, in the modern workforces, and the biggest problem with today's workforces is that the systems, the incentives, and the norms are not aligned with what actually increases engagement and productivity.
Why is that?
And that's because we focus so much on these short-term results, on growing as fast as we can, as big as we can. We applaud the companies that scale the fastest. But when you scale the fastest, when you only focus on short-term growth, long-term, you're going to breed resentment. You're going to have turnover. I mean, we see this in your introduction when you were talking about Ford and he was focusing on the short-term growth. What happened was in order to keep employees, he had to double their salaries.
Right.
That with every organization, are you willing to double your employees' salaries?
Right. He literally made those workers the highest paid factory workers on the planet in order to accommodate the increased stress that came from the decreased sense of autonomy and purpose that came with the monotony of working on the assembly line. And so if you want to ramp up scale and efficiency and speed, you actually have to strategically design the ways that people work to accommodate for that. The way he did it was by increasing people's pay.
But that doesn't work forever. And in the 1980s, Ford actually had to do a complete revamp of their culture to actually focus more on collaboration, more on getting employees to feel like they actually have autonomy. And that was because they were losing market value in comparison to Japan, which was outrunning them. And so they needed to look at, okay, how can we actually increase innovation in our workplace? How can we actually drive meaningful results? And it wasn't just about burning out their employees more, about, creating them as just functional employees. They had to think about how do we create collaboration and innovation in a new way? And they really focused on that. And so Ford doesn't operate the same way it used to. And a lot of companies we're seeing, so that might work for the short term, but in the long term, it's going to go down and you're going to have resentment. And we see this happening with so many companies today. We see Starbucks, Nike, Boeing, all changing over their CEOs and starting to refocus on culture, starting to refocus on Nike particularly has really been focusing on this with their new CEO. They brought in someone who was a culture icon within the company who really cared about individuals. So many people have come out saying, I love this CEO because I really felt like I had a personal relationship with him. And they didn't feel that way about the previous CEO.
But how could we be at this point in 2025 where we've had so many back-to-back decades of innovations in the business world, of learning so much about culture. We've had new regulations passed, as the decades have gone on that are advocating and supporting worker well-being. And we know so much in the research around what makes effective leadership and culture. How can we be in this place where we know so much and yet disengagement seems to be at an all-time high?
Yeah, so what happens is we often might know a lot, but that doesn't mean we always do it. Sometimes our actions are not always aligned with what we know is right.
Yeah.
We often act outside of our own best interests. I mean, have you ever, as an individual, we all make these mistakes. So sometimes we operate outside of our best interest. We spend 5 hours scrolling on social media when we know it probably would have been better for us to cook a healthy dinner, work out, spend time, with some of our friends, or spend quality time, with our kids who are maybe sitting there playing and we're scrolling on TikTok. We do things that are outside of our best interests. And because sometimes it reaps short-term rewards, and those short-term rewards are incentivized. They're incentivized in the business world by investors. They're incentivized by short-term wins, by seeing stock prices go up. They're incentivized by a lot of things. We see stock prices immediately go up when companies lay off employees. But in the long term, that isn't always good.
Yeah. So knowing the path is different than walking the path.
Yeah.
And ultimately, although we know so much, it's hard to consistently be implementing what we know works out there because it can be hard. And it can be hard, particularly when things are moving so fast and changing so rapidly in the modern work landscape. So I'm curious for you, why do you care about culture and when did that start?
I think culture has always been something that I deep down have in some way cared about. I didn't name it as such. So in college, I helped start and run a news organization. It was outside. We didn't like the way that the state, there was a newspaper that was being run by the college. We didn't like how it was being run. We thought that we were being suppressed from writing stories about the college. Nice. And so we created our own outside journalistic organization.
Nice.
And so
What
I
was
built
it called?
this. It was called Downtown Devil.
Nice.
And so I built this with some friends. They were really the leaders behind it. And then I eventually took over it when they graduated. And their it was really about culture from the beginning. It was really about the relationships, the friendships that we had, what we all cared about, the mission, about making sure that we were sharing information that was really valuable to the student body. And right there, without even knowing it, I was investing in building culture. I was investing in the younger, junior, employees at the time. They were students. They weren't actually paid for what they did. So I had to work even harder to inspire and motivate them because no one's being paid for what they're doing. They're doing it because they care about it or because they want to get experience. And so we were building a culture. We were building a community in ways where we all cared about the same vision, the same mission, and we were supporting each other in our growth and development. And so that was my first, start of what does it feel like when it's really good? When the incentives aren't, how can we build this as fast and as big as we can? But then over time, as I went to organizations, as I got my first job, as I got several jobs afterwards, I started to notice the problems within culture. I started to notice what it feels like to have a manager that I feel really demotivated by. I once had a manager who was really critical of me, who was really harsh, who would constantly tell me that my writing was too feminine. And I remember just feeling so insecure in myself and how much that affected my mental health, how much that affected how I thought about myself. And I didn't understand it at the time that my manager was really one of the biggest causes of my unhappiness in my life. And finally, when I left that job and I went somewhere else and I had a leader that believed in me, I was like, oh my God, this is what was the difference. And that was the moment where I really started to care far more about the culture and about how our leaders drive culture and how we feel in the workplace, because I felt that experience of feeling so unmotivated, so burnt out, so pushed beyond my limit, and feeling like I had no control over it. Now I understand that there are more things I could have done in hindsight, but at the time I didn't have the tools.
Sure.
And so I really feel passionate about helping give people the tools and the agency to start to make ripple effects of the cultures within their own organizations, or have the empowerment to be able to leave and find an organization that is right for them, because those ones are out there.
Sure. And what do those organizations do? Like the organizations and the leaders that you've worked with and that you've seen, where then you go, oh yeah, they're doing it right. What are the things that they're doing?
Yeah. So the leaders, first of all, in great organizations, what leaders do is they don't just talk the talk. They actually walk the walk. They actually showcase what they're doing. So instead of saying, it's okay to come to me if you have any questions, or it's okay to make mistakes, or it's okay to acknowledge that you don't know the answer. Instead, what great leaders do is when they're asked a question, they say, hey, actually, I don't know the answer to this right now, but you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to research it and I'm going to come back to you. They don't make it up. They don't brush it off. They follow what they want their employees to do. So first, they walk the walk. Second, they build trust and they build psychological safety. In our first podcast interview, I talked about Google's Project Aristotle and how they studied the best performing teams to decide and figure out what made some teams innovative and what made other teams not. And that single most important factor was psychological safety. So great cultures, great leaders are able to build a culture of psychological safety, that people feel safe to express their opinions, to express their beliefs, to say, hey, I see there's a problem, and raise it and not be afraid of those things. So they walk the walk, they build psychological safety, then they create accountability and recognition. So what do I mean by accountability? Well, it's not just about them doing the right job, but them watching their other managers, watching their other leaders. And if someone is behaving in a way that doesn't treat the employees well, is in a way that over prioritizes only results over also the relationships and also caring about the employees, they call that behavior out and they create accountability for that person to grow into a better version of themselves as a leader. Then they recognize when people are doing a great job. And they don't just recognize, say, you did a great job. They're specific. They say, oh, you did a great job making sure to proactively look into this bug before raising it as a concern so our customers never had a gap. Right. So they call it out ahead of time. And a study by Office Vibes shows that 69% of employees would work harder if they felt their work was just better recognized. So simple, yet so many of us don't do this as leaders.
Yeah, in the last 2 years, we've talked to a few thousand leaders and employees that work for that particular manager, and astoundingly, like far and above all of the other behaviors, when we ask what's one thing that your manager could do that could improve your experience of being at work, recognition. is the number one thing that shows up. And not just like any recognition, but recognition that is timely and authentic and relevant. Meaning it's like, you don't wait until the performance review once a year. You don't wait till like the end of the quarter. That you are within a reasonable amount of time from when someone does something that's valuable and important, you highlight it and you communicate it to them. And you do that in a way that actually feels like it's coming from you as a person authentically. And that you are recognizing not just the things that are relevant to the business, but you understand them and what matters to them enough to also recognize things that are relevant to them.
Yes, and that's what a great leader does. Is they're able to see, and this is why, a CEO can't manage 500 people on their own, and that's why they have other people who are helping them look at the specifics. That's what each manager is responsible for, is not just, managing results, but also managing how the people feel about their work and being able to notice those little specifics of what's this person want to grow into? Who's this person becoming?
Sure.
How can I support them in becoming this?
Sure. Here's another thing that amazes me just about this conversation, which is you and I haven't talked about before what are the key behaviors that we see leaders or cultures do well when they're doing it right. But ultimately, very similar framework. When I talk to organizations, I talk about the 3 Ps of empowered culture, which are purpose, meaning that you're able to communicate what's the purpose of what the business is doing, mission and vision, and also why you care about it and connect it to those people's values. And then processes that maximize people's ability to regulate their stress. So you're not just driving with your foot pressed against the accelerator. You allow space for resourcing, and processes that actually are focused on people being able to collaborate, receiving recognition, communication, and key people skills, that you're building trust based on how you interact with people with those people skills. And that happens to me a lot with people that I interact with that are either elite leaders or are elite thinkers, coaches, consultants, trainers that work with elite leaders and organizations. And it's a key signal to me that shows the answers are out there, that this really isn't a knowledge gap problem. This is about us implementing what we know works in ways that are unique and specific for whatever you're trying to do with your business.
Yeah, and it can feel hard at first. If we're seeing problems in our organization, trusting that some of these things are going to work, especially because there's so much evolving, so much has changed. So some of the data from the past is actually a little bit outdated. So figuring out what does work today for your organization.
And there's so many buzzwords that have come and gone where it's
Totally.
like, it can feel like by the time something gets to your desk, it's hard to know, like, is this something that's actually grounded in like the research that works? Is this something that's relevant for us? Is this just like a buzzword that's become popular? I've seen so many that have been buzzwords that like we've tried that haven't necessarily worked. So how can I really trust this one this time?
But that foundational principle over and over and over and over again is invest in your people. Pay attention to them. And I love that was your 3rd P, because that one is the one I find that most organizations forget. They create the set of values, they create the processes, but they forget the people.
Right.
And the people is the one that's most important. What does your employees actually care about? What matters to them? Why are they showing up here? What are their problems? And if we can understand those, we can build a better organization. Because if you rush forward too quickly and you don't know what their problems are, you don't know why they're going to resist your next big strategy, then you're going to spend way more time afterwards trying to fix it. And so if you can just know that the biggest and most important thing is invest in your people, figure out, and it's, it can seem, okay, is it really, really hard to figure out? You're like, maybe I'm more of an introvert. It's not about, being the most charismatic person in the room. It's about spending the time that other people in your organization, there are 3 things you want in your organization individuals to feel. You want them to feel valued, seen, and respected. So if you can just focus on those 3 things, valued, seen, and respected, that will completely change your organization.
Yeah, well, because then when I feel valued, seen, and respected, I can actually lean into pouring in effort and creativity into what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm. And seen is also the ability to feel like that's that specific praise. So people know that they're being praised for the work that they're doing. Respected means that they can show up as who they are, their full identity. They can show up and say, okay, I'm going to come to work as my full self. And I'm not going to be, have anything horrible said to me about my identity or about who I am or how I'm showing up. I'm going to be respected for the work that I deliver and how I show up in the workplace.
Yeah. And what's funny is those three things are things we have known since the birth of industrial organizational psychology. That's the Hawthorne effect.
Yes,
It's like
exactly.
we discovered it almost 100 years ago. And so again, it's about practicing what we know and like committing to the work, and that's part of I think what's frustrating about culture, which is it's never done. Like it's not you have one amazing leadership retreat or one really awesome offsite where then you iron out your revamped posters that you're going to put on the wall and the revamped things you're going to say on the website, and then you're good and you can focus on just like executing tasks and pushing forward projects. It's actually embedded in how you operate. And so how do we actually, as we're doing work, just going through running a business, how do we continually audit and improve the way that we manage our culture?
Yeah, absolutely. So it starts with making sure that all the managers and everyone who's a leader in the organization has direct one-on-ones with their employees, that they have a direct line of communication, that the employees can talk about issues, that they feel
Sure.
someone there is hearing them, someone there is in their corner.
Because this is about
not just
relationships,
it's
and
about
they need to have those touch points with another human where they're getting that feedback and they're feeling seen and they're getting evidence that they are valued and respected.
Yes. And so then if the manager is seeing that there are problems that they can't fix themselves, they should be raising that up to those above them. There should be a clear line of communication from the manager on maybe a team that's maybe 10 people to his manager or her manager and their manager's manager. And there should be some way of flowing that communication so if there are problems, it flows upwards and the people that are able to make decisions to change things are able to do so.
So you should have some agreements and at least some minimum viable structure or processes
Feedback loops.
that empower that practice of feedback loops.
And that can also be done also with engagement surveys. If you have an HR department, can also be done, quarterly, checking on engagement, understanding what employees feel about, where they're frustrated, allowing them to give feedback that isn't tied to who they are so that they can actually share anonymously in case there are problems that need to bubble up.
But then you need to do something with that feedback.
Yes, absolutely. It's not just about getting the feedback, it's about actually doing something about it. It's about actually then, assessing and understanding, what can we do about this? And, it's that really important process. It's really hard for us to continue to do work on things like this. We want to do the thing that's sexy in the moment, thing we've heard about. That's why we saw all these companies, these tech companies a while ago, throwing pizza parties, adding foosball tables, giving
Right.
perks.
Right.
And they thought for a moment, because it was spiking a quick increase in engagement, but that's not what increases engagement over the long term. And the long-term stuff is harder. And it is consistency. It is about showing up time and time again and caring about your employees. But the good thing about this is it's not revolutionary. And that's actually a good thing. It's actually like a thing that we can do to be consistent. We don't have to chase the hot new trend about what employees care about. We have to know the fundamental principles and just follow those.
You don't need to take a shit ton of capital and invest it into totally transforming your culture. It's actually about transforming the ways that you are doing the things that you have to be doing to run your business anyway.
Absolutely.
So what if somebody's listening and they're like, yep, I'm bought in. And you know what? We do engagement surveys. We do one-on-ones. And, I think we're actually pretty good at sharing feedback upwards and sideways and down about, what's going on in the organization. I really would like to get better about like how we measure and manage culture. Are there other like tools and resources that come to mind for you that like folks should really explore or use?
Yeah, so if people really want to be measuring feedback, so like I said, the engagement surveys are actually really foundational. They actually work really well. So like I was saying before, sometimes we're looking for the hot new thing when the principles, the things that you're doing already work. So what you should look at is, are there different questions you should be asking? Maybe you're like, everyone's saying on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy are you with this organization? Or how likely are you to stay at this organization? Well, maybe you need to think about, are there different questions I need to ask?
Sure.
Do I need to be more specific? What challenges am I starting to see? Can I ask questions specifically about that?
Are you measuring what matters?
Exactly. Are you measuring what matters? And so it's not about doing something totally new. It's about figuring out what you're measuring and figuring out, can you measure something better? Are there better metrics to measure?
Sure. And a lot of times what I find in organizations is you can change a few questions and you can get rid of other questions in your engagement surveys. And then there's all kinds of organizations that have already been doing this, but even breaking up different pieces to go into being pulse surveys that you can either, text or send to people in Slack or email, but breaking it up so it's not such a huge cognitive lift for everyone in your organization to be giving you that feedback, thinking strategically, not just about what do we want to ask, but what do we not need to ask? What's the best way to frame some of these questions so that we are measuring what matters? And what's the best way for us to deliver the asking?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's really powerful. And, thinking about sometimes the way that we frame a question can influence how someone responds to it. So thinking about, is there bias or is there an agenda already written into the way that we're framing the question? And can we frame it maybe in a different way so that we might get more honest answers?
Sure.
And, I know a lot of organizations want to not have anonymous surveys. Well, that actually doesn't encourage people to totally be honest sometimes. If you have a culture that doesn't have trust, doesn't have psychological safety, and you say, oh, all our engagement surveys are great, but they're all tied to each employee's identity, then you're not going to get real results. So it's this balance of you sometimes want to know the identity so that you can talk to those specific people, but you also need to give them opportunities to share things that if their identity was known, they might not share otherwise.
Sure. And I think some of that also comes down to doing the research and strategic thinking on the front end to improve quality throughout, to be able to figure out what sort of questions are really important that we keep anonymous. And if there is real value to having non-anonymous responses, what are the things that would be really helpful to do that with? And what are the ones that people would actually be willing in our organization to actually make non-anonymous? And the power in that is when you can make that a dialogue and people can feel like their voice is a part of shaping the ways that you're even gathering feedback and measuring your culture, the very act of engaging them in that dialogue then gets to help them feel more connected and safe in the organization.
Totally. People are far more likely to be invested in a change if they felt like they had a say in it, even if the change goes in a different direction than they wanted it to.
Yeah. Which is huge. I mean, that's one of the big hacks I find in culture shaping and culture management is just expanding your strategy around how you're dialoguing with people about even shaping your culture.
Mm-hmm. And when there's pushback of any sort, it's really about getting curious. Where's the sliver of truth there? Because sometimes as leaders we say, I did everything right. I worked so hard. Why aren't they buying into this? And it's like, well, where's the sliver of truth of what they're pushing back on? Yeah. Let's get curious there.
What do you think the future of culture management looks like in workplaces through the next 5, 10, 15 years?
The culture, so in the next 5 to 10 to 15 years, I think culture is going to evolve in similar directions that it has been. It's going to be even more focused on relationships than before. It's going to be even more focused on us feeling like we feel safe in the workplace, that we feel the workplace is where we want to be. I mean, we're seeing this with demands of Gen Z. Gen Z is demanding even more so than previous generations that they feel like they are fairly treated, that they feel like they have work-life balance, that they feel like their pay is fair, and that they feel like their managers respect them.
Sure.
And I think it's just going to continue to go in that direction even more so. And so, we're going to see leaders who are going to not need to be just domain area expertise. They're going to need to be primarily people first leaders.
Yeah, I mean, one of the cool things with artificial intelligence and the datafication of everything is that there's this opportunity to build companies that deliver tremendous value with less and less upfront cost, that you can do more with less people. And the amazing thing with that is we can get even more companies out there and people can accomplish amazing things in smaller teams. And in order to do that well, you're going to have to prioritize culture shaping and culture management, because if you're Amazon, you can afford to burn through people because you can pay them top dollar because you have such capture of market share that you have so much revenue, you have so much cash to play with. You can do like what Ford did early on, which is, okay, we might not be able to actually improve the quality of people's workplace experience, or we might not want to, but we can always find people that will take the money we'll pay them to do this role. But the vast majority of companies can't do that. you can't pay people to be the absolute highest paid person in the world at their positions. And so that means you have to, if you want to be able to compete and you're not one of the top 10 largest companies in the world, you're going to have to actually explore what are the principles and strategies and practices we're going to put in place to actually shape and manage culture in a way so that people want to work here.
Yeah, absolutely. According to a study by MIT, if employees consider a culture toxic, they're 10 times more likely to leave that company. 10 times more likely to leave that company if they believe the culture is toxic. And like you said, if they're a big company like Amazon, they'll be able to get more people because they can pay them the amount. But most companies, as you mentioned, are not going to be able to afford that. So you can't afford to just have this high turnover and completely be losing employees. It costs a lot of money to retrain, to rehire a new employee. And so you want to retain them. So you got to figure out, okay, what can I actually offer? Not just pay. What can I just offer that's actually going to be valuable to them? It's actually going to want them to stay motivated here. It's going to want them to believe in this company.
What do you think about the relationship between culture and leadership?
Well, the leaders build the culture. So the culture is not just built by employees. It's really fundamentally built from the top down. And it shouldn't be built by the top down, but they set the stage. If the leader, if the CEO is abusive to his employees, or she is constantly yelling at them or giving them no days off and creates an always on culture, then that's going to burn everyone out. And as much as each individual employee is trying to show up as, kind and caring to their colleagues, if they have this top down leadership that's really, harsh on them, that's not going to set the stage for a good culture. Sure. So everyone is responsible for culture, no matter what level of leadership you're in. But it really has to be from the top. That leader has to showcase how they want others to show up.
That makes a ton of sense. Yeah, the way I think about it is your culture is essentially a story, a story that is written through the behaviors that happen at that workplace and the systems that you put in place for reinforcing, allowing, and disallowing behaviors. Yeah. And so what that then means is if you look at the people within an organization, everyone is always contributing to shaping the story of what that culture is. And the more influence and responsibility you have up the hierarchy, the more influence and power you have in shaping what that culture is. And so you can almost think about it, if you could think about your organizational tree and think about where you are in that. It's like that's how many culture influence points you have. The things the CEO does, sure, it matters a whole lot because they represent a lot in people's eyes as far as what this company is about and what their work experience is going to be about. But they're not the only one that matters. Every single person contributes to it. And so if you are 2 levels down and you manage people who also manage people, you have a ton of influence over a ton of people about what their experience of that culture is. And so it's almost like conversation about culture is always a conversation about leadership because ultimately everyone is responsible for the culture of the place that they work within. And that what I hope in the future is that we all commit deeper to our responsibility for shaping the experience for those that we work with and that work for us. And so it's like a deeper care in leadership that includes a deeper care for culture.
Yes, absolutely. And, I often get asked, okay, but I work at, a culture that I don't think is very good, or I work at a toxic culture. What do I do? My CEO, my boss is problematic. Can I shift or change the culture at all? And what I say is actually yes. There are limitations, but yes, you can. This is how it works. You take your team. You show up the best you can for your team. You create psychological safety. You create, as much as you can recognition on when they're doing things that are right. You involve them in the decisions that you're making within your scope. And what happens is you'll see your team will start to outperform other teams. And other people will look around and they'll say, hey, what's going on that team? Why are they doing so well? And then maybe they'll promote someone within your team to go to another team.
Sure.
And you'll just start growing. And that will start to expand. So there is ways of starting to do it, of taking your own agency, saying, what can I do with the people directly around me? Can't influence the person above me. Can't necessarily, you can influence them, but you can't necessarily change them entirely.
Sure.
And so if you can't change someone 7 levels above you, can you change the people just directly around you? Yeah. And then maybe at some point you say, hey, I've done as much as I can here, and this isn't actually the place I want to be. There's another culture out there that I can have even more impact. And maybe you leave. But there is place that you can start to have a ripple effect, even if you notice that it's pretty toxic around you.
Yeah, it's that Buckminster Fuller idea that the best way to make an old system obsolete is to create a new one that outperforms it.
Yes.
And so like you want to transform the culture in, no matter what seat you're in, you can have some sort of influence towards that happening just by transforming the way that you operate with the people that you work with. And to your point, that has potential payoffs for transforming the culture of the place that you're in. And maybe it doesn't. And if it doesn't, you know how amazing it's going to be if you go looking for another job, for you to have stats that you can point to and you can say, there were these challenges in this workplace, and despite those challenges, here's what my team did because of these specific things that I did. Mm-hmm. And now you've turned that entire experience into an advantage to your career journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's opportunity to grow for yourself, there's opportunity to grow for your team, and there's opportunity and lessons for those who are underneath you as they grow into leaders. Because all of those people who are once underneath you, they might grow into leaders someday. If you set the good example, think about all those other cultures that you might be impacting.
What are your favorite resources out there as far as books, courses, tools, anywhere that people can go to learn more about culture, culture shaping, culture management?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Simon Sinek is one of my favorites. Sure. Start with why. I think that is a beautiful, his foundational principle of the book is that people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And that goes to that foundation, that values. What are we creating together as an organization? And so when you're thinking about building the values of your organization, reading that book is a really phenomenal starting place.
Sure. So start with why, Simon Sinek.
Yeah, start with why, Brene Brown, the power of vulnerability and being able to and understand how you should show up as a leader and how that creates a ripple effect for how other people show up. Another really big, powerful one. Ironically, I actually think Esther Perel is a really beautiful one. So she talks about romantic relationships, although she does have a podcast called Work Life, or not Work Life, that's Adam Grant. She has a podcast about working relationships. But how she talks about how we build relationships, because I think relationships are the foundation for a great culture, understanding her principle of like rupture and repair, that sometimes we actually have to, make a minor rupture in a relationship and then repair it dramatically. And that's what makes a relationship stronger.
Totally.
And that's what feedback is, in an organization. When we need to give our employee feedback, it's a kind of micro level of increasing the level of conflict. But hopefully we're going to build a stronger relationship with that person. We're going to drive them forward. We're going to increase and improve their performance. And so we sometimes have to have a little bit of conflict in order to have things move better. But those are some of my favorite thought leaders that I think are really great to think about.
Awesome. I think we just covered a shit ton of ground.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to share some places that people can connect with me. So
Please.
Also, I run a course called Management Mastery, Communicate with Influence. So for any leaders that are looking to up-level your leadership skills, your level of influence in your organization, this would be an amazing course for you. I run it both on Maven and also privately for organizations. So people can find me at jessgoldberg.com. And there I run company trainings, workshops, programs, offsites, and, would love to connect with you. You can book a free call with me. You can find my course, or I also have a ton of free resources on the resource page.
Beautiful. All right. Well, Jess, thank you. I'm kind of sad that we're getting close to this is the end of our second. We have one more in this mini series.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to diving in with you about AI.
That's right. So if you've listened to this one and you didn't get a chance to listen to Jess and I's episode on leadership, please go back and check that out. These conversations really build on one another, and we hope that you'll come back for next week's on artificial intelligence and how that relates to both leadership, culture, and the future of work.